Forced into marriage, she wept on her wedding night, but found in the Marquis a blazing passion. The bells tolled as if the stone itself had a voice. Helena felt the vibration in her ribs before she crossed the chapel threshold. Wind pressed against the oaken door and slid in at the hinges, threading through beeswax and damp petals. A thin scent of lilies rose in the cold like a memory that refused to leave. Her hands were steady because they had to be. The veil grazed her lips each time she breathed. She kept her eyes forward, counting the flagstones by color, by flaws in the slate, by anything other than the faces turned to witness a union born of necessity. He was there already, composed beneath the arch. Tall, dark coat cut with military precision, the white of his linen a flashing line against somber cloth. The Marquis of Northbridge did not fidget. He did not glance at the doors. He watched her approach with the restraint of a man who had trained himself to endure anything and to show nothing. The bells gave one more strike, slightly off the moment. The sound slipped into her bones like a cold draught beneath a door. The words began. The phrases of contract and vow, old and unornamented, fell between them with the weight of legal promises. Helena answered when required, her voice lower than she expected, the syllables catching once on her tongue and then clearing. She did not look at the few faces allowed to stand witness. She looked at the hands that would soon take hers. The Marquis's hands were steady, long-fingered, the right knuckle pale as if habit had taught it to clench, and then taught it not to. "Do you?" someone asked, the way doors ask whether they will be opened. "I do," she said, and felt her throat grow warm because it was not a lie and not the truth. It was what must be said to keep her father's creditors from opening their own doors. When it was his turn, the Marquis's voice did not falter. It was not unkind, it was exact. Each word sat where it belonged. His gaze did not avoid her. It held, dark and unreadable, as if he believed a person could be examined for damage and reassured just by looking. A quiver went through him when the bells trembled again at the wrong instant, almost as if someone somewhere had pulled the rope too soon. It passed so quickly, she might have imagined it. But she had made a life of noticing errors in columns of numbers, small and telling. She marked it without meaning to, and filed it the way she filed a discrepancy, with care. Her mouth was dry. He had offered a square of white linen at the entrance to the chapel. Formality extended like a bridge. She had refused it because pride made smaller distances seem larger. Now she wished she had accepted, if only to learn how he folded courtesy in his hands. They exchanged what needed exchanging. The air was colder near the altar. The light slid over the carved stone, picking out a lamb, a vine, a sword. Her name was spoken, then his, the syllables binding not to romance but to obligation, and yet the ache that rose behind her eyes was not bitterness. It was a kind of grief for what might have been if the world had been gentler to both of them. A book was brought. The page left for signatures smelled faintly of iron gall ink. Her hand did not shake as she wrote her maiden name for the last time. The Marquis signed in a firm, architectural hand. Each letter a bar, a lintel, a brace. Sand was shaken to dry the ink. She watched the grains glitter and felt very suddenly that the ground beneath them all was only ground and could not catch a person if she fell. When they turned, the small congregation murmured the low approval society knows how to produce at will. Helena did not meet anyone's eyes. She allowed the veil to veil. He offered his arm. She took it. The contact surprised her, warmth beneath wool. The fabric rasped lightly as they moved together down the narrow nave. He was careful not to set too brisk a pace. He modulated his stride for hers without seeming to. The bells ceased. The door opened to the corridor. Quieter air welcomed them, layered with the smells of polished wood, hearth smoke, and the faint sharpness of iron from a poker leaned against stone. A lamp on a bracket threw an amber ellipse onto the wall. She kept her hand light on his sleeve. He kept his forearm firm as if any weight she might place upon it would be accepted without comment. At the chamber threshold she paused, because pausing was the only thing that was hers to choose. He registered it with the smallest turn of the head, and did not urge her forward. The veil shifted against her cheek. She felt how the house listened for them. "Lady Northbridge," he said at last in that clear, tempered tone, and only that, no promises, no claims. "Marquis," she returned, the single word both address and boundary. He opened the door and stood aside. The room beyond was warm and meant to be gentle. A low fire worked past the first blaze into the deeper, even heat that keeps hands from going numb. A bed hung with dull blue damask, waited like a stage it had not asked to be part of. A small table held a decanter and 2 glasses. A warming pan leaned against a hearth tile, its copper face a pale, dull sun. A basin stood upon a stand with folded linen. Helena stepped in. The floorboards under the carpet gave a small, soft sigh. She did not know where to put her hands. A maid appeared and disappeared with the discretion of a well-trained ghost, taking pins, gathering them on a little velvet cushion, leaving behind the faint metallic scent of hairpins that had warmed against a scalp. When the last pin loosened, a narrow strip of white silk whispered free of her hair and slid down her shoulder. It fell to the floor as if silk could be a sound. She reached for it. He was there before her, not hurried, just near. He bent and lifted the ribbon with a measured, one-handed grace, as if anything that belonged to her must be touched without haste. He held it for a breath, palm open, silk coiling upon itself like something alive, then looked at her. "Your ribbon," he said, the 2 words careful, not presuming entitlement. "Thank you," she answered, equally careful, and kept her hands at her sides because reaching would have meant something she did not yet know how to mean. He set the ribbon upon the dressing table. The lamplight made it paler. She stood nearby, aware of the way the heat tugged at the back of her legs, the way the cool air made the skin of her arms pebble beneath the light weight of silk. Her throat tightened around breath. She could not see how to begin such a night except by not beginning it. He did not press. He went to the fire and took up the poker, tilting one log so it sank and settled, sending a brief rosy fountain of sparks that scattered and died. "You will be comfortable," he said, and it should have been a platitude, but he turned the phrase in his mouth as if he meant to take it seriously. "We will try to be," she said lightly, because lightness was a tool sometimes, though it fit her now like someone else's glove. He did not smile, but the corner of his mouth softened, which in such a face felt like more than most men would have given. He poured 2 small measures from the decanter. The liquid caught light. He brought one to her with the air of a man offering a negotiation he hoped would succeed. "To warmth," he said, nothing more. "To warmth," she echoed, the words landing like a truce on a map they had not yet drawn. They sat in 2 chairs, angled not quite toward each other, not quite apart. The fire cradled silence. Cloth rustled softly when she moved. Outside, somewhere distant, a door eased shut with the tired sigh of old wood. She listened to her own breath, because listening to his felt dangerous. He took his time with the glass. He set it down half full. He removed his gloves and placed them on the small table with the care of a man keeping order when order was mercy. With unhurried movements, he slipped off his coat and folded it, laying it across the back of a chair, and in the doing revealed a body accustomed to discipline as well as the scar of posture. It was not that the room was cold, but a fine sheen of damp gathered at his temple, like someone who has come in from a wind and has yet to feel warmed all the way through. Helena watched without staring, a talent learned in counting houses and crowded parlors, seeing without making a spectacle of seeing. Her mouth softened into an involuntary, almost smile when she realized his precision was a form of kindness here, not control. He was giving her space, and space in a room like this was oxygen. His eyes slid to the ribbon without moving his head. It lay on the dressing table like a bright line. He did not look at it again. She did, and then away, and then back. He rose and crossed to the hearth. His right hand trembled along a fraction of an inch as he reached for the poker again, then steadied as if he had told it to. The trembling was not real. she might have said to herself if she had wanted to spare either of them. But honesty was a cheaper thing than lying, and kinder. She stood because sitting made her feel as if she were waiting for something that would come whether she waited upright or not. She moved to the dressing table, touched the ribbon with only her fingertips so it barely moved. Silk slid beneath skin, the smallest friction. "I will have water sent," he said, turning to the bell pull. "Please," she said, grateful for something practical to say. He pulled once. The cord whispered. The house breathed. A moment later there was a gentle rap. A tray was set just across the threshold by hands that did not hurry and a presence that did not intrude, and then the quiet resumed with the perfection of a drawing room that has been closed. They navigated the territory of small tasks together, as if doing so could teach them cooperation. She poured, he held the basin. She dampened a cloth. He placed the pitcher back precisely where it had stood. When she offered to return the favor, he shook his head once. "I am well," he said, and even his refusal was gentle. "You look tired," she answered, testing a narrow span of honesty, and waited to see if it would snap. "Only today," he said. They did not speak the truth that days make weeks and weeks make lives. They did not speak of her father or of the ledgers in her head, or of the arithmetic that had set them here. The omission was not false. It was kindness. Both of them recognized it and decided to let the decision stand for now. "You will sleep," he said after a moment, and the unadorned sentence contained more generosity than an elaborate declaration would have. "Yes," she said, though she did not believe it. He moved toward the door to the outer room, perhaps intending to give her privacy, while the maid returned to undo the last unkindnesses of pins and laces. He paused, as if calculating whether speaking again would make things better or worse, and chose not to. When the maid had done and gone, leaving the small sweet scent of soap and violet water, Helena stood before the fire and allowed herself exactly 2 tears. They were not noticed by anyone who would repeat them. The heat dried them almost at once. She touched the ribbon's edge again. Habit wanted to tie it back into her hair where it belonged. Instinct wanted to hide it. She did neither. She let it lie. He came back, slower than he had left, as if he too had found some private ledge and stood upon it. He accepted the distance the room offered. He did not tell her to come. He did not ask. He stood where a man stands who recognizes that power can bruise and decides, even tired, not to bruise anything. The fire shifted. A coal caved softly in on itself with a sigh and a scatter of cinders. "Do you want the curtains drawn?" he asked, nodding toward the bed. "No," she said, meeting his eyes because not to would have been another kind of fear. "Not yet." "Very well," he said. A light tapping came from the corridor. Not urgent, not contrived. The everyday knock of a house functioning as it should. He turned his head, and she felt something draw tight in her chest, because ordinary interruptions can carry extraordinary things. "Come," he said, his voice steady. A narrow tray appeared over the threshold, the bearer gone almost before their eyes had adjusted to the door's opening. Upon it lay a folded paper sealed in red wax. The seal was unbroken. The paper had the slightly heavy weight of something meant to impress. No name was legible from a distance. No flourish announced a friend. He took it. The paper made that particular sound good paper makes. He looked at the seal. He did not change countenance. He did not ask her permission to open it or inquire whether she might wish to read it. He did not break the wax. She waited. The heat of the fire touched her ankles. Her heart touched the back of her throat. The room watched, if rooms can be said to. He crossed to the hearth. He stood very still for the space of 3 breaths, as if measuring an argument on some invisible scale. He turned the folded paper once in his hand. The seal gleamed. He did not break it. "Is it important?" Helena asked. And the question was simple, which is the most dangerous kind. "It does not deserve to be," he said, each word precise, and in the way he said it, lived the fact that he had already decided how much life he would grant whatever it contained. He held the corner of the paper between finger and thumb and lowered it toward the bed of coals. Flame took the paper in one soft lick. The wax bubbled and darkened, an insect hum of sound. Smoke rose as a gray ribbon and wrote its brief script on the air. She found she was holding her breath. She let it go because breath is not a thing to waste. "You did not read it," she said, not as accusation but as observation, and perhaps as a test she was not sure she wanted to grade. "No," he said. "Why?" "Because it was written to make me do something other than this," he said, without looking away from the fire. And she did not know whether this meant their marriage or his refusal or the ridiculous, dangerous kindness of letting a person cry twice without comment. The edges of the paper curled inward. Her eyes fell to the white ash forming, the way it powdered and then lifted and then fell again, like weather. The wax went black and then dull red and then was gone, only a blistered dot where a crest had been. She stepped closer because the desire to see was stronger than the decent impulse to leave a man alone with what he chose not to read. The heat warned her back at the last inch, stinging the thin skin over her knuckles. He did not move away. He did not tell her to be careful. He watched the burning with the same attentiveness he had given to the vows. It seemed to her for an instant that he was carrying two kinds of fire and measuring which would go out first. The last corner held stubbornly. A little rectangle of white stayed white longer than the rest, defying, then surrendering. Flame licked and folded it to a black rim. A line of ink, no longer words, darkened and broke. Helena opened her mouth to ask him another question and closed it, because questions can be instruments as sharp as knives, and because the only answer that mattered would not be given tonight. He reached for the poker. He nudged the charred paper farther into the coals until it belonged wholly to the fire and not at all to any human hand. He put the poker down. He looked at her then, directly. Something in his face had steadied, or perhaps something had released. It was like the feeling after a bell stops, silence still ringing in your ears. She wanted to say, "Tell me." She wanted to say, "I will not harm you." She wanted to say, "I am already too far in to retreat with dignity." She said, "Shall I ring for more wood?" Because sometimes humility is the only available courage. "Thank you," he said. And in the thanks, there was as much truth as if he had said 10 dozen more important things. She took the cord and pulled gently. The bell's voice carried away down the corridor. The room made a space for the future in the form of 2 new logs laid upon old coals. He went to his folded coat and lifted it without thought, and the silk ribbon she had left upon the dressing table was not upon the dressing table any longer. He did not pocket it while she watched. He had done that before she knew to watch. Men are capable of such acts of stealth when the purpose is not conquest, but protection. She thought, wildly and without reason, that perhaps he intended to give it back to her when she had earned it. Then she scolded herself for the word, because people are not prizes and vows are not coins. Still, the image stood, stubborn as ash that will not blow free. Footsteps moved somewhere beyond the door and stopped. The last corner of the burned note broke loose and rose in a slow, pale spiral, and in the hush that followed, a single firm step halted outside the threshold. The step halted outside the threshold and held there, steady, as if the house itself were taking a breath. Helena looked at the door. The Marquis did not move. Heat from the hearth hummed against the hush. Then the latch lifted with polite caution, and a footman edged in with a bundled armful of split logs. His gaze stayed just low enough to see without seeing. "Forgive the hour, my lord," he said. "Mr. Ellis thought more wood might be welcome." "Thank you," the Marquis replied. The logs touched the hearthrug and made a dull, good sound. Resin bled a clean scent. The footman withdrew almost before the words had fully settled, the door closing in a hush of leather hinges and oiled iron. Silence came back. It had weight, like a thick curtain. The fire cracked and unbent a blackened edge of paper into new ash. "I will take the outer room," he said, as if the decision had always been ordinary. "You will not be disturbed." "Thank you," she answered, and the two words felt like a piece of furniture she had moved often, a chair lifted precisely so it would not scrape the floor. He inclined his head and turned, a man maintaining line in a narrow hallway. At the connecting door he paused long enough to add, without dressing it in anything, "If you need anything, pull the bell." She could think of 6 things she might need that had no bell pull, and said, "I will," because he had offered the only practical power the moment could hold. The door clicked into its keep. The fire dipped, then rose. She stood until standing became an act of defiance against a room that had been arranged to soften surrender. The bed curtains hung like a question. The decanter reflected light on its round shoulder. The ribbon was gone from the dressing table. She went to the hearth and sat. Heat rolled against her shins. Close to the grate, the bed of coals glowed in muffled reds and oranges, little cities on a map seen from a night coach. The outline of the burned paper showed briefly, delicate as a leaf skeleton, then collapsed into itself. Her throat tightened. She did not cry. Tears were a currency, and she spent them with care. She turned her cheek to the back of her hand until the hot cold of skin and fire taught her to breathe again. In the outer room, a sound of cloth and wood indicated a chair being set back, a coat folded. He had taken her ribbon. She could not decide whether the theft was presumption or shield. Perhaps both, depending on who one chose to be about it. She rose at last, and let the maid undo the last laces with fingers that stayed efficient even as she yawned behind her teeth. The maid departed with a soft good night and a glance at the fire that calculated how long it would hold a banked heart. Helena climbed into the bed because pretending a chair could defeat exhaustion would be foolish. She left the curtains open. The linen was cool and smelled of starch. She lay on her side and listened. Someone moved in the outer room and then stilled. The house had its own music, the faint tread of a watcher in the corridor, the wind at the leaded panes, a settling creak where 2 beams had known each other for 2 centuries and still found things to discuss. Sleep came the way water fills a basin, a slow reach, a final, soft flood. She woke before light, the kind of waking that has no cause but itself. The room was grey-blue at the edges. The coals, now low and moon-red, held just enough heat to show the grate's pattern. Her hand lifted of its own accord and reached for the ribbon that was not there. Habit is a faster mind than reason. She sat up. The dressing table's surface shone faintly with the polish a maid had given it. On the wood lay a small coil of white silk, tidy, as if arranged by someone who respected the thing and what it meant. He had placed it there at some point between his taking it and now. It sat waiting like a promise that did not demand to be believed to be true. She looked toward the door to the outer room. Silence answered. A light fanned in at the curtain seam. Dawn touched the moor, and the moor sent it into the house. Birds had the insolent courage to sing. Somewhere a boot hit a flagstone. Someone yawned. Someone laughed low and was shushed. Morning began. She swung her legs from the bed. Cold reached for her feet and then gave up when she slipped them into slippers. She tied the ribbon around her wrist, not her hair. The silk lay against her pulse like a quiet oath. The bell rope hung within reach. She pulled once. The maid came with hot water, towels, a simple gown suited to morning. They worked without conversation until the last pin was coaxed into its cushion. "Will you take breakfast in the small dining room, my lady?" the maid asked. "Or shall I have a tray brought here?" "In the dining room," Helena said. The house would have to be faced the way sea must be faced when one lives by a coast. She left the chamber and found the corridor cool and clean, wide enough to make a person feel slowed by its dignity. Portraits watched. A coat of arms carved above the stair took the light in its shallow cuts. On her left, a tall window showed the courtyard where 2 grooms were slinging pails in practiced arcs. Coffee scented the air like a rumour. She reached the small dining room on the first floor. It had a window toward the east, and now the sun pushed a pale band across the table and lit the silver with honest light. The butler stood with that perpetual knowledge of an entire building's needs held behind his eyes. "My lady," he said, inclining, "my lord is on his way." A footman relieved her of the slight shawl she had taken against a draught she had not met. He moved a chair for her. A domed cover lifted to let out steam, the meat-sweet smell of smoked haddock, the clean lift of eggs. A little army of spoons, forks, and knives stood like troops awaiting a general's nod. She sat. Small panic scratched her ribs at the sight of 3 spoons that seemed to be arguing about their purposes. The Marquis entered. He paused, as if measuring whether he would disturb a calculation, and then greeted her. "Good morning," he said, tone a measured offering, no presuming closeness, no distance calculated to wound. "Good morning," she returned, and found a smile for the room because rooms notice if a person is at war with them. The butler poured coffee. It ran dark and promising. The Marquis took his seat opposite, the sun lighting the edge of his jaw and making a mild halo of the steam curling from his cup. She looked again at the spoons. He followed the direction of her glance without appearing to. His mouth arranged itself at one corner again. Not a smile. Precisely a kindness. "The small one likes eggs," he said. "The larger for soup we will not have until noon. The longest is for the custard, Mrs. Hales will refuse us, because she is certain we will faint if we have it in the morning. The egg has a preference?" She heard the dry patience in her own voice, and was faintly astonished to find it there so early. "It may be a stubborn egg," he said. "One must conciliate eggs when possible." "Conciliate," she repeated, and the word folded itself into her like a small laugh she permitted to exist. "I shall attempt it." She set the tiny spoon to the egg cup and felt an almost childish relief when it worked, because it meant the day would allow at least one small victory. He pretended not to see the relief, and therefore saw it with grace. A plate went down before him. He took only a little. He seemed to eat food because a human does, not because he enjoyed proving anything he could do to it. "Will you walk the estate this morning?" he asked, as if he had meant to ask, and was glad to have reached it. "If I will not hinder business," she said. It came out almost formal, and then she softened it, because life was long, and politeness could be gentle if one allowed it. "I should like to see what is real." He looked at her then. She felt the look as one feels sunlight through glass. "It is all real," he said, so simply she wanted to argue for the sake of resisting the feeling that he had waited for someone to say it. "We will be back well before noon. The lanes are decent. There was less rain than expected last week." "I have boots," she said. "Good," he replied, and in the single syllable there was what might be approval. Breakfast arranged itself into a reasonable thing. Coffee refilled what courage took. Bread crust gave way under butter like a human accommodating a plan not entirely objectionable. The Marquis allowed a pause to become permission for the day to begin. They left the dining room without haste and found the pale morning full. In the courtyard, a light cart waited with a pair of cobs whose ears turned toward voices and then forward again in soldierly readiness. The steward stood near the wheel with a ledger and the particular patience of men who reconcile columns with reality. "My lord," he said, nodding. "My lady." "Mr. Ellis," the Marquis returned. "We will see the lower meadow first." "Yes, my lord. The far tile came loose in last night's wind," the steward replied. "Tom set a ladder." Helena climbed to the cart and settled onto the narrow seat. The Marquis took the place beside her, leaving room enough between them to honor the newness and the iron rules of it. The cobs set their shoulders to the lane. The castle slipped behind as if a great creature had decided to sit back and watch. Fields lay in low green, hedges made their modest fences, larks made fools of themselves in earnest joy. The air had that clean smell loudly called cold by those who do not live with it daily. They passed a cottage where smoke rose straight up from a low roof. A woman looked up from a wash basket and dipped her head without dropping her smile entirely. Helena noted the patched place on the thatch. The way the replacement reed was a shade paler, the neatness with which it had been laid. "You see it," the Marquis observed, without specifying what "it" was. "Yes," she said. There was no point pretending. "The thatch will match by next month." "By next rain," he corrected mildly, and the exchange left behind it a little warmth that was not fire. They reached the lower meadow. The steward's Tom had set the ladder as promised. A corner tile of a feeding shed had lifted. The Marquis stepped down and set his gloved hand to the rung, testing it, then handed off his gloves and went up with the unshowy competence of someone who has done so before. Wind caught his coat at his shoulders and made a dark flag. "Careful," Helena said, then regretted it, because caution can become insult if pressed on a person already careful. He looked down and the glance did not chide her for caring. He set the tile right, checked its mate, and came down without haste. "Thank you," said the steward, and it did not sound as if he had been required to say it by rank. They moved on. At a wellhead, he lifted the bucket and let it fall, listening not for echo, but for the way the chain moved in its groove. At a barn, he shouldered the weight of a poorly hung door and saw the hinge needed a slim wedge rather than a complaint to the carpenter. He spoke to a boy with a splinter in his palm and removed it with clean hands and a clean knife. He did not ask for thanks. He accepted them when they were given. Helena watched the transformations. In London, she had seen men pretend at care with speeches. This was quieter. It was something that happened between one thing and the next, leaving the next better. The bell in the distant tower marked the quarter. The sound traveled on the wind and caught him a fraction off guard. His breath paused. It resumed almost at once. He set his shoulders as if he had remembered something and refused to be its servant. She said nothing. She kept pace. She had the sudden, unwelcome wish to reach for his sleeve and anchor him to the day. She folded the wish small and put it where it could not embarrass either of them. By mid-morning, they turned the cart back toward the house. Clouds were forming in elaborate scrolls along the horizon, not yet threatening, only hinting at the drama rain likes to bring to moor and mind. "There will be weather by afternoon," the Marquis said. "We shall want to see the gutters before it arrives." "Do gutters mind being seen?" she asked, to keep him easy and herself in the habit of speech. "They misbehave when unobserved," he said, with a shade of dryness. "They are like cousins of certain sorts." She breathed a near laugh. He did not chase it. That was kindness, too. The castle received them with moderate fuss. It is proud to be useful. In the great hall, a table had been set with cold meats, bread, and a little decanter of sherry for those who believed in such things at noon. A clock ticked with the confidence of an old retainer who has never been late in his life. A maid darted past with a folded cloth clutched to her middle and a look of panic appropriate only to someone newly employed and lost. Helena stepped into the library while the Marquis spoke with the steward about repairs. She paused at the threshold. The room belonged to a different species of time. Light fell along long shelves in a way that made dust look like a slow snow. Chairs had been placed where a person might sit to forget they were sitting. A large table near the windows held a few things arranged so neatly they could only have been left that way to be found. She moved closer. A pocket watch lay open. Its hands stood at a minute long past, its face a pale circle against dark wood. Beside it, a small brown glass vial nested in a shallow dish to keep it from rolling. A folded paper packet of powder sat under the lip of the vial dish as if someone had mislaid it, and someone else had decided to keep the mislaying tidy. She did not touch them. She stood and looked until the knowledge of looking grew heavy. Her first thought was that it was a man's things, set out for use, and then abandoned for a reason not visible. Her second was that certain scandals in London had taught her the names of substances a person ought not accept without question. Laudanum had its stinging, sweet odor when opened. When closed, it had only the absence of smell and a promise. Rain tapped the glass once. Then again. The sound was tentative and then more sure, like a mind approaching a decision. She reached toward the watch and stopped a breath before contact. A footfall behind her, quiet and measured, let her lower her hand without having to confess curiosity. "My lady," said the butler, respectful as always, "Mrs. Hales would be grateful for your preference regarding the afternoon tea." "My preference," Helena repeated, drawing herself back from the table, "is to trust Mrs. Hales." The butler allowed himself the smallest relief. "Thank you, my lady. She will be, I believe, very relieved." "Is there," she began, and chose her words with care so they would walk where she wished. "Is there much that requires arranging?" He considered the question, not just for its words, but for its request. "My lord's cousin proposed to him this morning that a small gathering might greet the new Marchioness properly. Mr. Ellis awaits instructions." "The cook has strong feelings about game when rain comes." "So there will be a gathering," she said, because the line between statement and question would tell her whether she was being informed or invited to think. "My lord did not refuse his cousin's proposal," the butler said, which was the sort of answer one gave when a decision had been made and left open in the way that important decisions sometimes are when time and propriety must catch up to them. "Of course," she said. "If Mr. Ellis requires a hand with lists, I have fingers suited to columns." "I will tell him," the butler replied, with a look that registered her offer as more than politeness, and then he was gone with the quiet competence of one who knows what must happen before anyone else notices it has. She glanced once more at the watch and the vial. She left them as she had found them. Some questions would be asked in rooms that were not public. Some questions deserved answers only when answers were ready to be true. She returned to the hall. The Marquis lifted his head from a short conversation with the steward, as if a line drawn in a ledger had met its mate and made sense. "We will need candles for tonight," the steward said. "If the rain comes hard, the draught finds the joints." "See to it," the Marquis replied. His eyes slid to Helena, then away, like a man resisting the habit of asking a thing aloud. After noon, the house reoriented itself. Rain came in clean sheets, and then in slanted blows. It drummed and then snared and then settled into a steady hand. The air inside turned to the intimacy only weather can give. The housekeeper's keys made a sound like a very small bell as she walked. The cook sent up the smells of butter and thyme as a statement of intent. Footmen polished what was already polished, because the occupation kept them from envying the rain's freedom. Helena found the rhythm of the place and let her pulse learn it. She stood in the doorway to the small parlor where ledgers were kept and asked the steward to show her the household books. He hesitated for the length of one breath, and then laid them open. She ran a finger down a column of outlay and did not judge it, only learned it. He watched the way she watched and relaxed. "Lord Everley has a list," the steward said, because one speaks of such things when they cannot be unspoken. "Guests from 3 houses. A gentleman from town to demonstrate a new instrument. 2 ladies known to the late Marchioness." "The list," she said. "May I see it?" He handed it to her with the carefulness of a man making a statement about who belongs to what. Her eyes skimmed, then rested on a name she did not know, and a description that was too bland for innocence. A gentleman of learning invited to the country. She did not ask what the learning might be. The cardstock had a London stationer's imprint at the corner. Respectable, expensive. The hand that had added the names had flourishes Helena now knew. Everley's choice of pen made as much theatre as his choice of people. The Marquis came to her shoulder. He stood close enough that she sensed his quiet rather than felt his heat. He tilted his head toward the list. "If it is decided," she said, careful with the tense, "Mr. Ellis will need to know how much wine remains and whether the lower servants must be engaged from the village." "It will be decided," he said, which told her the direction of the wind without pretending it was her job to bring the canvas up the mast. "And the house will hold it," she said. It was not flattery, only recognition. "I will not be useless in it." "You are not useless," he said, and the word "not" did more work than any compliment would have. He turned toward the hall. The butler came forward, as if summoned by a thought rather than a bell. The Marquis nodded once. "Proceed." "Yes, my lord." Orders travelled like the threads in good cloth, seen only if one looked closely. The housekeeper revised linens. The cook altered menus to suit reign and appetite. The steward made figures march in the ledger's columns like good soldiers. A groom was sent to the village with 3 envelopes and 1 card placed under the butler's paperweight to wait for the next coach into town. Helena stood by the window and watched rain write itself down the glass. It made the world beyond a water painting, the trees reduced to wash and pale trunk. She pressed her wrist where the ribbon lay, and the silk warmed to her pulse. The Marquis crossed the hall and paused by the long table where papers gathered and were sorted in a daily tide. He lifted 1 envelope and set it down again. He took up a blank card, wrote a name in a tight, controlled hand, sanded the ink, and watched the sand flick into its dish. He placed the card beneath the butler's paperweight, a square of marble that had held more than 1 decision in its time. "Will you read in the library?" he asked, turning toward her. "I will try to read," she said. "The rain has better voices." He accepted the answer like a man who believed books waited patiently. He glanced toward the eastern windows. Lightning made a low, distant seam along the edge of the moor. "It will strike nearby and then pass," he said. "We have had the tower checked." "The gutters," she said, remembering. "Done," he returned, and something in his tone told her the house had been secured against more than water. Dusk moved in early under the weight of cloud. Lamps were brought to life one by one. Shadows bent themselves to furniture. The kitchen sent up a sound like purring when the oven doors opened and closed. The butler lifted the paperweight and slid the card toward the nearest light. The name, once revealed, looked like the shape of a thought she did not wish to have. He covered it again, efficient, as if he had seen her look and chose not to. "Shall I send the groom now, my lord?" he asked. "If the lane holds," the Marquis said. "No further than the village tonight." "Yes, my lord." Helena returned to their chamber to change her shoes. The room had been put to rights. The ribbon lay again on the dressing table, coiled as if silk could think. She touched it with the back of her finger and felt the question in it, the question the house had begun to ask without words. Thunder rolled, not near, but near enough to be noticed. The air had that charged feeling that makes a person unconsciously hold their breath. In the hall, the butler lifted the marble from the card one last time. Ink dried dark and certain. The seal fell with a practiced press. The groom took the letters in his leather pouch. He set his hat, put his shoulders to the storm, and stepped out, while under the weight of polished stone, a single card addressed to a gentleman in town waited for delivery with the storm crouched over the moor. The storm took the card from the butler's hand and tried to swallow it whole. Rain pressed at the door as the groom stepped out with his leather pouch tight to his chest. Wind caught the lantern and blew it nearly flat before it righted with a shiver. The butler shut the door and stood for one breath, with his palm on the wood, as if blessing a messenger. The marble paperweight sat again on the long table, claiming another card underneath, a name addressed to town, while the house turned itself inside out for company. Helena remained at the window until the rain began to sheet sideways. The glass went from clear to blind and back again. Footmen moved through the blur like men walking in a dream with trays and candlesticks and folded napkins that looked like stiff, proud birds. Somewhere, Mrs. Hales argued with a pan and won. The housekeeper counted linen with a rosary's attention, and then counted again. "Shall I lay the yellow service, my lady?" the maid asked at her elbow, breathless from errands. "The white," Helena said, then caught herself and added, softer, "The white keeps its head in a storm." "Yes, my lady." The answer traveled. White porcelain appeared and settled into place. On her dressing table, the white silk ribbon lay coiled like a sedate thought. She lifted it and tied it at her inner wrist, under the fall of her sleeve, where it could think with her pulse. Night did not yield easily. It stalked along the corridors and tugged at the candles until the men came with snuffers and trimmed the wicks into clean points of flame. The Marquis conferred with the steward in low sentences that carried more doing than speaking. Helena watched him measure the weather like a man who had learned to respect forces he could not command. "Mrs. Hales requests permission to add a fish course," the butler announced, appearing as quietly as a change in barometer. "If the moor allows the river to behave." "It will misbehave," the Marquis said dryly. "But she may have it. The men from the village will not faint if they meet a few bones." "Very good, my lord." Helena drew a long breath. "There will be music?" "Yes," the Marquis replied. "Mr. Ellis engaged the village violinist. He is better than he knows. And dancing. If the floor holds." "I trust it," she said, and only the two of them understood that she was trusting more than wood and nails. He inclined his head. That was all. It was enough for this hour. Rain slackened toward dawn, the way a man falls quiet after a long argument. The sky grayed. Lamps went out, one by one, like a constellation agreeing to rest. A team clattered into the yard. Another followed. Carriages took the gravel with the authority of those who believed invitations to be a species of law. The house tightened its bodice and smiled. Helena stood at the head of the stair with the housekeeper just behind, ready to be useful if usefulness was requested. She knew how to be arranged as something lovely in a room, and allowed it, though her hands itched for a list, a sum, a task that would prove she belonged. The Marquis came to her side and gave her his arm. The gesture was formal. The warmth of him was not. "Lady Northbridge," the butler intoned, as the first carriage stopped. "Lord Everley." Silas Everley brought the weather in with him without getting wet. He stepped over the threshold in a coat that knew London and smiled the way a cat smiles to convince a room it has always been welcome. "Cousin," he said, easy as wine, looking past the Marquis only enough to let Helena know he saw her. "And the new Marchioness. Radiant. The county will be grateful." "We hope to spare the county inconvenience," the Marquis said. "Ah," Everley returned, as if discussing a hunting schedule. "And a small celebration is not inconvenient, but a balm. Consider me at your service." "I will," the Marquis replied, and the slight curve of silence around the words warned any listener with an ear. Behind Everley, a man in a dark, well-cut coat and traveling hat stepped in and removed the hat with careful hands. He had the tidy economy of someone who prefers to touch objects rather than people. The butler accepted the hat without comment. The man's gaze tracked the stair, the hall, the bell rope. One flick, one mark, one note written where rubrics go. He bowed to Helena at a proper angle. "Doctor," Everley said in that friendly way that makes the word light, "do you not find country air refreshing?" "I find it different," the physician replied, voice even. "I am obliged by your hospitality." "Northbridge hospitality is a county proverb," Everley said to the room at large, and the room, being polite, did not contradict him. Helena smoothed her glove as one might smooth the surface of calm water, and the ribbon under her sleeve shifted against her skin like a hidden ally. "Welcome," she said, and heard the layer under her voice that told the trained not to presume more than welcome. More guests followed. A gentleman and his wife from the neighboring estate with a fixed smile between them. Two ladies whose gowns proposed that fashion could protect a person from rain. The violinist from the village arrived pale with importance and bright with pride, carrying his case as if it held his heart. People shed capes and shook off droplets that glittered like scandal in light. The house filled with it, the sideways glances, the small admiration, the curious cruelty that passes for entertainment when there is nothing else to do. Helena held her chin level and let her eyes be intelligent, not naive. She could be made to blush. She would not be made to stagger. When she could breathe without feeling watched, she leaned toward the Marquis's shoulder and let her voice find the place between form and intimacy. "Everley means to be useful," she said, as if remarking upon a bouquet. "He means to be seen to be useful," the Marquis answered, equally low. "There is a distinction." "There is," she agreed, and the agreement shaped a thin wire between them that would hold for now. Music began. The violinist found his courage in the first long note, and then could not be stopped. Couples took the floor with that civilized hunger the gentry have for patterns they can master. Helena accepted a dance with the Marquis because refusing would have called attention to something that deserved none. He took her hand, with an exactness that told her she would not be made to feel foolish. They moved together in rows and turns, figures learned in childhood and called up now like saints for help. The floor held. The house seemed to approve. It happened on the third set. The chapel bell, perhaps unsettled by the storm, offered a single brazen clang at an hour that did not require it. It cut the music across the middle like a blade through silk. She felt him still. It lasted long enough to count to 2, no more. His hand on hers went rigid, and then remembered itself. He resumed. No one who did not care would have seen. She did. The physician did. Everly smiled without teeth. When the dance ended, the Marquis bowed as if nothing had passed through him but music. He stepped aside and gave claim to other partners. Everly intercepted him with a toast that pretended to be gracious and felt like a bird trap. "To health," Everly said, lifting a glass. "To peace," the Marquis answered. "To whatever allows us to sleep," Everly added, eyes bland as cream. "Structure," the Marquis said. Helena turned away because not every battlefield needs a witness. She let a lady submerge her in talk of ribbons and church flowers and the cost of candles. The ribbon under her sleeve lay warm, an anchor for a ship that had not yet broken its moorings. A footman passed with wine. His hand jarred at the wrong instant. Claret ran sudden as blood onto the Marquis's cuff. "My lord!" The apology came too quickly, too rehearsed. "It is nothing," the Marquis said, most of his attention on keeping his hand level. The smallest tremor fought him. He won, but the victory cost invisible coin. The physician was there without being seen to move, offering a cloth already folded to the right shape. The Marquis took it and wiped his cuff with the quiet dignity of a man choosing not to see an insult, because to see it would give it strength. Helena's chest tightened. She took a step toward him. Everly pivoted to intercept, a smile easy, and a voice pitched as if making conversation about the weather. "You must find the house lonely when the west wing is shut," he said to her, eyes innocent of anything but concern. "I told Northbridge he should open it for his bride. Air does much." "The house keeps our comfort without entire openness," Helena replied. "Air can be found in rooms built for it." "But secrecy can stifle," Everly murmured, just for her. "There's care and there's concealment. A delicate line, and a durable one," she returned, "when kept by a good hand." He laughed softly. "Ah, brave. You will make him admit he needs you. How fortunate that your arrival solves so many inconveniences at once." She tilted her head. "Inconveniences. You know how debt collects like damp," he said. "You sweep it out, but it finds the corners. Your father must bless your courage." "Lord Everly," she said, and the name stopped him as effectively as a closed door. "A person who speaks of damp should own a mop." He lifted his hands. "Touché. Let us say only that families help families. And if one could ensure a cousin exempts himself from strain, well, one is a cousin for a reason." He melted into the next group before she could hazard a reply that would show her teeth. She stood with her breath caught, unspeaking. The violin slid into a waltz and blurred the edges of conversation. She watched the Marquis give the physician a nod meant for any gentleman offering a handkerchief. She watched the physician accept it, as if it were proof of his place. A matron approached Helena with a smile sharpened for gossip. "Your husband bears a name that keeps the county respectable," she said sweetly. "One prays, he bears it well." "He bears it without your prayers," Helena answered, polite as a church door. The lady blinked, surprised by the weight of the wood, then remembered an errand that did not exist and departed. Helena exhaled, slow. She found the steward at the edge of the room, a ledger in his hand because comfort wears many costumes. "Mr. Ellis," she said under the music. "My lady. The list you showed me, has everyone arrived?" "Yes, my lady, except the gentleman from town. Send a groom at first light. He will go." She let the conversation end where it could do no harm and returned to the Marquis nearly at the same moment he turned toward her. Their eyes met across 2 paces of polished floor. It felt farther. "Will you," he asked in a tone chosen for a crowd, "be at ease if you retire early?" "I am not tired," she said, which was not quite true. "But I will not keep you from your guests." "They are not mine," he said. "They belong to weather and opportunity." "I suppose we all do," she murmured. And then, because subtext suffocates when given no air, added gently, "If there is anything I must know, tell me now." "Only that the storm makes men foolish," he said. "And that I will not have you harmed by it." "Storms do not ask permission," she returned. "They arrive. I can still bar certain doors," he said. She felt the words catch in her. He had not told her to leave. He had not asked her to stay. He offered a door. She looked at it and at him, and could not tell which was kinder. He glanced toward the physician, then toward Everly speaking to a clump of men as if reciting a small play, written only for malice. He made a decision she did not hear but felt. "After breakfast," he said, quiet and final, "you will go to town for a few days. You will be more comfortable there while we finish with this weather." "Finish," she repeated, and it was a small word with many rooms. "Do you think it will be finished when I return?" "I mean to make it so. And I mean to stand here," she said, the plea inside the sentence covered by silk. "With you. You will stand better if not aimed at," he said. "Do not ask me to pretend otherwise." Her eyes stung. It was not rejection. It felt like it. She nodded, because there are times when argument appears valiant and is only vanity. "If you will send," she said, very calm, "for the carriage after breakfast, I will be ready." He inclined his head. That was all. That was the harm. That was the care. Music filled the room again, mercifully. Conversation climbed back up the walls like ivy. The physician smiled a thin smile at no one in particular. Everly took a glass he did not need and admired the storm through a window as if he had ordered it. Helena left the hall when she could do so without making a trail. In her chamber, she opened a small writing box and took out paper, a pen, a bit of sand for drying. The table's polished surface reflected her hand like a ghost. She wrote only a few lines. Truth does not require ornaments. She folded the sheet and closed it with a wafer. She drew off the ribbon from her wrist and bound the letter with it, crossing, tying, smoothing the silk with her thumb, as if the act could steady the man who would read it. She placed the letter on the center of the dressing table, where no tidy hand could move it without noticing. "Will you need assistance, my lady?" the maid asked softly from the door. "Not yet," Helena said. "In the morning." When she turned to lift a shawl from a chair, the door moved at the edge of her vision. She looked back at the table. The letter lay where she had left it. She exhaled, set the shawl down, and crossed to the hearth to stir the coals. It took half a minute. When she returned, the ribbon lay unbound on the polished wood, as if it had never held anything at all. The letter was not where the ribbon was. Her breath stopped. She did not cry out. She picked up the silk and felt it cool and unhelpful in her fingers. She searched the obvious places a neat creature might move a paper to, under the tray, beside the mirror, in the blotter. Nothing. The maid had gone to fetch hot water. The corridor held its evening quiet as if it had been made of wool. She thought of Everly's precise hands and the physician's precise eyes, and swallowed fury and fear together until they tasted the same. Sleep did not take her easily that night, but it came as all fatigue does. She woke to a morning that had washed its face. The sky was the pale of a watered silk. The house smelled of rug beating and resolute coffee. She put on a traveling dress that could handle town and country both. She did not look for the letter again because looking would be an admission. Downstairs, breakfast occurred, as if the previous night had been an illustration, rather than a wound. Spoons stood at attention. Bread offered itself. The Marquis did not ask whether she had changed her mind. He would not ask. He walked with her to the door as any correct husband would. Everly materialized near the stairs and tipped an invisible hat to them both. "Safe roads," he said warmly. "The lanes can be cruel after rain." "They are better than most men," Helena replied pleasantly. He laughed, let the sound show his teeth, and moved aside. The carriage waited, lamps already doused for daylight. The coachman sat straight on the box with a look that said he had driven in worse and would do so again. The maid took her place inside with the exactness of a soldier. Helena placed one hand on the doorframe and felt the wood, felt the house swell and shrink with breath, felt the ribbon at her wrist like a pulse that was not hers alone. The Marquis stood below the step. He did not kiss her hand. He did not touch her arm. He said, close and low, "Send word when you arrive." She nodded. It was all she could manage without saying something that would pull the whole careful fabric apart. She climbed in, the door shut. The interior smelled faintly of leather and lavender. The coachman called to the horses. Reins tightened, wheels rolled. At that exact moment, two men in sober coats walked under the portico with Rain on their shoulders and a clerk at their back, the physician in their shadow, and lifted stamped papers in official hands, while one of them raised his palm toward the coach to halt it. The hand lifted to halt the coach froze Helena at the hinge of choice. Rain had washed the yard clean, but the sky held more. The coachman's reins tightened, then loosened a fraction as he weighed the raised palm against the order already given. The maid's gloved fingers gripped the strap. Outside, two men in sober coats stood beside the physician, their papers folded and sealed, their purpose stamped into the posture of their shoulders. Helena put her hand to the door latch. It was cold, and the cold steadied her. "Stop," she said to the coachman, her voice clear through the small window. "Wait." The carriage eased back to stillness. The physician's face was the mask of a man who preferred quiet rooms. The taller official inclined his head with the courtesy of someone who knows power obviates the need for rudeness. "My lady," he said, "we are come with application regarding the soundness of—" "I am aware of what you are come to do," Helena replied, and the ribbon at her wrist pressed into her skin as if to remind her of a better purpose. "You may speak to the butler. He will inform my husband." The Marquis stepped from the house before the butler could. He had not put on haste like a cloak. He had come with the same steady economy that made him bearable in a storm. For a breath, his eyes found the coach window. She felt the look as if it were a hand. Then he turned to the men with the seal. "You will wait," he said. Not a question, not a plea. A statement of order in his own yard. "We are authorized to," the shorter man began. "You will wait," the Marquis repeated. "In my hall. My butler will see you out of the rain." His voice did not lift. It did not ask for understanding because he did not need it. The men glanced at the physician, who blinked assent as if to keep the scene orderly. They stepped under the portico. The butler bowed without warmth and ushered them in. Helena pushed the carriage door open. She descended in a single motion that had cost her pride to learn and her life to require. "I am not going," she said, standing on the wet stone. The Marquis's jaw tightened, then eased. "You will be safer." "No." She swallowed the softer words and left the hard one. "Not today." He did not argue in public. He tipped his head toward the chapel court. "Come," he said. "We will not be interrupted there." She walked beside him across wet stone. Rain ticked from the gutters like a clock. The chapel door stood ajar, a black line drawn in stone. He reached it and paused. "I will be 2 steps behind you," she said. not sure why saying it mattered until it did. He opened the door and went in. The chapel had not changed since the vows. Beeswax, damp stone, the smell of lingering lilies that had never been told whether to rejoice or mourn. The light came thin through leaded panes and laid grayness on the pews. The bell rope hung motionless in its arch. He took 2 steps toward the chancel rail and set his hand upon its smooth edge. The curve of his shoulders altered, almost as if the weight of his own restraint had shifted. He stood very straight. Then his breath went disordered. "Gabriel," she said, before she knew she would use his name. He did not answer. His hand flattened harder against the wood, a white flare blooming across his knuckles. Perspiration gathered at his temple without the heat to justify it. His right hand, the one that had held a sword at some time when swords were still asked to do things, trembled once and then again, as if an invisible musket drove its percussion against him. She crossed the floor. Standing in front of him with too much space between them would make a show of mercy neither of them wanted. She came to his side instead, shoulder close to his upper arm, as if facing the same altar would make them allies rather than adversaries. "Count with me," she said softly, quietly. In. Out. His breath fought. He refused to let it win. He closed his eyes, and even that was an act of will. She slid the ribbon from her wrist without looking down. Silk whispered against skin. She took his right wrist, slowly enough to be refused, and encircled it with white. He did not pull away. She crossed the ends and tied them in a small knot, leaving the tails long. She wound one tail around her own wrist, not binding it, only laying it there as if to make a single line from one pulse to the other. She did not tug. She breathed. "In," she said. 1, 2. He matched her. Sweat cooled. The tremor softened like a line of ink lifting under damp. "Again," she whispered. 1, 2. He followed. The chapel accepted them. Minutes have different weights. These had lead in them. They passed. He opened his eyes at last. They were very dark and very tired and very much alive. "Thank you," he said, and the words were not a surface courtesy. They were breath given back where it had gone to hide. "Stay with me," she answered, because asking him to be all right would be foolish, but asking him to be here was possible. "I will," he said, and the sentence landed between them like a hard thing they had earned. She released the ribbon from her wrist but left it knotted around his, tails falling like a pennant. He looked at it, then at her, and did not untie it. "We have visitors," she said. "I heard," he returned, and the dry twist almost made her smile. "Everly sent them," she said. "Of course," he said. He stepped back a fraction and leaned against the end of the pew, as if allowing wood to carry what his body preferred not to. He lifted his hand to his brow and then let it fall. The ribbon tails slid over his cuff like a promise he had not been aiming to make. "I will tell you," he said, "because I should have told you before, because I cannot bear you standing between others' voices and mine without the truth in your hands." She folded her hands and waited without crowding him with her attention. A silence that has been made safe can hold more than words. "During the war," he said, "a fall and a blow. Not remarkable at the time. Enough to make a man be more careful with his head thereafter. It made nothing in me untrue. It made certain moments, noise, suddenness, bells, regard me as if I were a field to be crossed without permission." He paused. She understood the shape of the sentence and what it declined to dramatize. She did not tell him she was sorry, because pity has its uses, and all of them are cruel. "I learned how to keep it private," he went on. "My father preferred privacy to rumor. The staff understood the difference between loyalty and fear. We managed. Rare now. Rare enough to call it not a condition, only a fact. Rare," she repeated, letting the word be what it was. "Everly," he said, and the name came out flat. Has long cherished the view that the estate would be better in his hands. In the spring, he acquired certain of Hartwell's notes. He found his leverage where a man does when he cannot make a case on merit. He wrote to me the night of our wedding. You saw the seal. She remembered the paper in the fire. Heat found her face again. She heard the words without surprise and felt them without forgiveness. He threatened, the Marquis said, to bring a commission if I did not allow him to meddle in leases and disbursements. He implied that a doctor would be helpful. The man in the hall, she said. He has given evidence in town before, the Marquis replied, at the request of men whose interests aligned with his recommendations. So you married me to protect the estate, she said. The sentence chose itself. He looked at her. He did not flinch. I married you because I needed an ally who could not be bought and because your father required relief. That is the unromantic truth. I did not expect, he breathed, and shook his head once, as if refusing an indulgence. This, she said. Storms, bells, you, me. Yes, he said. His mouth moved, and if a smile had been allowed into the chapel, it would have been born in that movement. I do not regret the thing that placed us here. I regret the manner of it. Regret is an honest coin, she said. It spends. It buys nothing I want, he returned, but it will pay for something we must do. She stepped closer, almost, and then did. Tell me. They will ask to convene a commission, he said. They will present a ledger, notes, observations designed to sound careful and be false. They will claim soundness is not present here. They will expect a wife to be confused by physicians and grateful to cousins. And what will we do? We will be dull, he said, with a resolution that felt like the first real warmth of the morning. We will bring facts dressed in plain clothes. Good, she said, and the word took breath like a person. We will need the household accounts, the steward's book, dates of improvements, sums disbursed, receipts. Yes. We will need to know when the apothecary keeps his shop shut, she went on, the merchant house in her blood waking as if called by its true name. If their book puts laudanum into your hands on a Sunday, it lies. The stamps on paper, they change. I can see which sheet was taxed last year and which was not. Ink tells time. If the doctor filled his ledger with whatever would serve him, he has played scholar, and he will be undone by his tools. How? He asked. Will we see his ledger? We may not, she said. But men who write too much love to leave copies. He carried a small book last night with numbered pages. A person who numbers his pages does not like gaps. He will have another, or he will have sent notes. And servants notice. He exhaled and let his head rest against the wood for a breath. You are brave. I am practical, she said. Courage is when practicality fails. He closed his eyes a second time. Stay. I will, she said, and the knot in the ribbon seemed to tighten of its own accord. They left the chapel as they had entered, side by side, the door giving back a small, hollow sound that felt like a promise. The hall set its face for war, without raising its voice. The butler managed the officials in the anteroom with the firm civility that makes a gentleman remember himself. The physician stood near a window with his hat in his hands, eyes moving like a man counting nails in a floor. Everly was absent, which was like him when work was required. The Marquis said to the butler, "Tea for our guests, then ask Mr. Ellis to bring the accounts." "Very good, my lord." Helena slipped into the small parlour where ledgers slept when not in use. The steward arrived a moment later, the big book already in his arms. He set it down as if offering bread. "My lady," he said, and added in a tone that made her throat tighten, "Tell me where to stand." "At my shoulder," she said. "On my side." He smiled without showing teeth. "Yes." They opened the book. Columns lifted. A year's worth of figures sat in polite lines, asking to be understood. She traced what meant something. Drainage paid at Michaelmas. A carpenter's bill settled early after wind. Blankets purchased in a late frost. Leases renewed. The steward supplied context like a man reading aloud to a person who can read, but wishes the company of a voice. "This entry," she said. £2 to Owen for the well. The day? He ran his finger. A Tuesday. "And this prescription," she said, lifting one of the folded slips the physician had left the day before, darkly suggestive of authority. "Dated on a Sunday. We will need the apothecary's book." "The apothecary closes on the Sabbath," the steward said, cautious. "You know it. I know it. But saying it is not proving it." "The housekeeper keeps lists," Helena said, "of deliveries. She likes to check them. She will recall if anything from the apothecary arrived when it should not." "If we must ask the vicar whether the shop keeps Sabbath, we will. But better the apothecary's own hand." Mr. Ellis nodded. "We can send a footman to ask him to bring his book. If he refuses, we will ask him to recite. He will not lie. His wife would hear of it." Helena allowed herself the smallest laugh. "Then ask the wife." The steward went. The housekeeper came, keys chiming like a discreet bell, and laid her own accounts beside the household's. "I am not clever, my lady," she said, "but I am exact." "Exactness is cleverness," Helena answered. "Show me when the apothecary came last." The housekeeper pointed, crisp. "Friday week. Laudanum for the kitchen maid's tooth. Mrs. Hales counted every drop. Sunday." She stopped. "No, never Sunday." "Good," Helena said. "Keep these close." A maid hovered in the doorway, hesitated, then squared her shoulders and stepped in. It was the same girl who had fetched hot water the night before, the one whose footsteps were quick and quiet. "My lady," she said, cheeks pinking with the audacity of speaking in such company. "The doctor's little book. He keeps his notes in it, but he has a habit." "Tell me," Helena said, turning toward her, lowering her voice so the girl could be brave without believing herself on a stage. "He numbers every page and puts a slip under the binding to mark the place. He did last night." He set it on the side table while Mr. Everly spoke, and when he turned to look at the windows, Mrs. Hales's niece bumped the table with a tray. The slip fell, and I put it back. But it was not paper. It was a copy of a prescription, I think. The stamp was wrong. We have seen the new stamp on the sugar cones these 6 months. This was old. The housekeeper made a small sound of approval. "Sharp-eyed," she said to the maid. "Speak plain, child. You'll not be put out for telling the truth." "It had last year's duty seal," Helena said, meeting the girl's eyes to calm the shaking in her hands. "You are sure?" "Yes, my lady," the maid whispered. "I noticed because I take the wrappers from the sugar, and I like to peel the seals. They changed in Lent." Helena's heart lifted. She did not allow triumph to show. "Can you fetch Mrs. Hales's niece?" "Yes, my lady." The girl flew. The housekeeper followed, proud and brisk. The butler slid into the doorway like a shadow and murmured, "The gentlemen inquire whether my lord is ready to receive them more formally." "My lord will receive them at the village hall," Helena said, before the Marquis could answer. "We will conduct ourselves in public daylight. They may take tea and learn patience." The Marquis stood at Helena's shoulder, and she had not heard him come. He looked at the butler. He looked at Helena. "Yes," he said, "we will do it at the hall." "Yes, my lord." The physician had drifted closer, as if curiosity were a magnet he could not resist. He smiled amiably. "I am always willing to be of service," he said, the words a silk glove on a fist. "We know," the Marquis replied. "You may convey your willingness to the magistrate." The physician's eyes flicked to Helena's wrist. The corner of his mouth moved when he saw the white silk ribbon tied around the Marquis's. He turned away as if he had seen a detail that mattered and disliked the implications. The day gathered itself. Rain lifted. The wind took a breath. A message went to the village, then returned with the news that an inquiry could be held in the morning. Public enough to satisfy curiosity, formal enough to satisfy law. The steward sent word to tenants who would be asked to speak to weather and work. The housekeeper polished candlesticks that would not be used and polished them anyway. Afternoon dulled into evening. The Marquis went to the chapel once more, not to struggle but to stand. Helena followed and took the ribbon from his wrist and tied it in a loop around the bell rope, low where a hand could grasp it without ceremony. He raised a brow. "So we remember to breathe," she said. "So we remember what we choose." He touched the loop lightly with his thumb. "We will not need it," he said. "Perhaps not," she returned, and allowed the hope to sit between them like a candle with a high, clean flame. They walked back through the court in step. In the hall, the officials looked up with the impatience of men kept waiting by those whom they do not recognize as their betters. The butler offered them another cup. They declined and asked to be lodged. They were told the village inn had space. "Tomorrow," the Marquis said to them. "At 10. "At 10, the taller man agreed, offended and affronted, and forced to be polite. They left in a whisper of coats. The physician bowed with care that could be read as respect or calculation. He did not look back toward the chapel. By night, the house had become itself again. Servants ate in the kitchen, low voices, a burst of laughter that made Helena's eyes sting in the best way. The steward closed the ledger with a sound that felt like putting a lid on water to keep it clean. The butler went quietly through rooms that would host no guests and saw that lamps were safe. Helena stood at her chamber window and found the reflection there, the outline of her face, the pale line at her wrist where the ribbon had lain before she hung it on the bell rope. She touched the glass. Cold met warm and made a small fog. A soft knock sounded. The Marquis entered with the restraint of a man determined to be a gentleman in his own life. "I am sorry," he said. "For what?" she asked. "Not to make him list his sins, only to let him determine what mattered." "For the manner, as I said," he answered. "For requiring you to carry a burden you did not choose." "I chose this morning," she said. "That is enough choice to make the rest worth it." He looked briefly, like a man who has been allowed to sleep. "You were right," he said. "To say storms do not ask. They come. I have spent years building doors to close against them. Perhaps I should have built anterooms instead." "Doors are admirable," she said. "Rooms where one can wait together are better." He nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. "We will show them the difference between a man who is ill and a man who has been injured. Between a house that hides and a house that keeps its secrets until they are needed. We will show them what is real," she said. He took her hand. He lifted it no higher than courtesy and kept it there longer than courtesy allows. His thumb pressed once where her pulse spoke. He let go before decency could be asked to leave. "Sleep," he said. "You too," she returned. She did sleep. Morning came quickly, clean-edged and pale. The house moved with purpose, dressed as calm. A simple breakfast sustained those who would speak and those who would listen. Boots were pulled. Cloaks were thrown over shoulders. The white ribbon, left knotted at the bell rope, swung slightly in a draught like a promise that expected to be kept. They rode to the village in silence that did not wound. Tenants walked in pairs, caps in hand, the steward among them with his ledger wrapped in oilcloth. The butler carried letters like a general carries orders. The housekeeper came as far as the lane and stopped, her eyes bright and dry. At the low building the village used to gather, voices hummed. The hall door stood shut. A man from the magistrate's office, the same who had held up his hand, stood beside it with a paper in his palm. The Marquis looked at Helena. She looked at him. Their hands found each other because that was the shortest distance between two human beings who had chosen not to stand alone. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said. They stepped forward together and stood before the door, their fingers still joined, as the latch lifted from within and the wood began to open on the hour they had made their own. The door opened on a room full of breath held too long. Helena felt the change in the air the way a sailor feels wind shift. The village hall was small enough to see every face and large enough to fit every opinion. Benches had been pulled forward and filled. Coats steamed against the walls. The magistrate sat at a trestle with two officials from Chancery on either side. papers stacked like a low fort. The physician kept to the edge of a window and held his hat like a shield. Mr. Ellis stood with the tenants and the butler, the ledger wrapped in oilcloth in the steward's hands. Gabriel stepped forward with her. His hand released hers only at the last moment, because there is a point beyond which a private gesture becomes a public argument. She felt the absence as a cool patch on her palm and let it steady her. The official on the left cleared his throat. "We will proceed," he said, too loud, as if to convince himself of the room's obedience. An application has been made to inquire into the soundness of mind of Gabriel Ashbourne, Marquis of Northbridge. Helena did not wait to be asked whether she would sit. She did not sit. She stepped to the front, where the trestle table could look her in the face, and gave her name without ornament. "I am Helena Ashbourne," she said, and her voice was not large, but it did not need to be. The room bent to hear her. "I am the Marchioness. I will speak before you speak about my husband." Heads turned. The magistrate lifted a hand, half warning, half invitation. "Lady Northbridge, I know what is at stake," she said, cutting nothing and no one, simply laying the words down where there was a space for truth. "You may inquire. You should inquire when someone asks you to. But you should also look. A man's mind is not a rumor to be weighed by those who benefit from his fall. It is a life. It includes his people, and his work, and his word. If you will hear about his mind, you must hear about his heart. The evidence is not in one book. It is in all of them." She raised her hand, and the sleeve fell back just enough to show the white silk at her wrist. She untied it with careful fingers and crossed the small space to Gabriel. No one breathed. She placed the ribbon into his open palm and left it there, slow, public, plain. "It belongs here," she said, so quiet only he could have heard, and the room nonetheless understood. He closed his hand around the silk with a control that trembled and held. He inclined his head the tiniest degree. She turned back to the table and nodded to the magistrate like a woman who knew the cost of courtesy and paid it. "You may proceed," she said. Gabriel stepped forward, and the left side of the room, the side that remembered his father and his grandfather, straightened. He placed the ribbon in his waistcoat pocket without drama and rested his fingertips on the edge of the trestle as if to steady the paper rather than himself. "You have the word soundness before you," he said. "Permit me to give you other words: drainage, yield, rent, weather. We are not a theater. We are a farm with more roofs than fields, and we must balance both." He lifted a folded sheet from the oilcloth bundle Mr. Ellis had unwrapped and laid it flat. It was a plan, drawn in a firm hand, of the lower meadows drains, lines and arrows and notes that spoke a language of cold logic and wet ground. "This," he said, touching the lines, "was put in after Michaelmas. The water that used to sit and rot the roots now runs in stone channels under the field and is carried into the ditch near the lane. You may ask the man who laid those stones whether I knew my own plan. He is here." A tenant with a weathered face and a Sunday coat rose awkwardly, cap in his hands. "Aye, he knew it," he said, voice climbing and then settling. "Set a string hisself. Said there's a drop on it 1 inch in every 2 yards. It does run that way, my lord, pardon." "No need to pardon," the magistrate said, with the faintest twitch of a smile. Gabriel moved to the next sheet. The bridge on Withers Brook. It was replaced rather than mended because mending would have failed by wit. "Joseph?" he asked, without looking down to see if the carter was present, because he knew he was. "Aye," Joseph said from the back, proud as a trumpet. "Saved me 1/2 mile each way. Got the barley in before that last rain when the old bridge would have made me wait and then sink me for the waiting." Helena watched him humbly master his own accomplishments, laying them out not as triumph but as accounting. The steward's ledger came open with soft authority. "Mr. Ellis read figures in low tones that were neither defensive nor boastful. The room had to lean in to hear, and so it heard. "Blankets," Gabriel said. "In the freeze. Mrs. Hart," he corrected himself with the smallest interruption. because the old habit had almost given Helena her maiden name, and he would not permit even that slight of her. Mrs. Hales kept a list. 20 blankets purchased, distributed with names. You may ask those names. He gestured. An old woman with a headscarf rose. We had the baby then, she said. She had a cough. My lord sent coal, right enough. It was Mrs. Hales sent the coal, Gabriel said gently. From your money, the woman returned, chin up, and it burned the same. The official on the left shifted and tried to make paper sound like authority again. My lord, no one disputes your generosity. The question is, whether your mind is... You will not finish that sentence without my answering it first, Gabriel replied, the edge in his tone nothing like anger and everything like dignity. I am not a poet. I am not a saint. I am a man who can draw a plan, reckon a field, and remember to leave a gate as I found it. If a bell strikes wrong, my body will remember other thunder for a breath. That is not unsoundness. That is memory. If a cousin wishes to make a field out of a man, that is not care. That is a trespass. A small, nervous laugh ran through the back benches, and then died, ashamed of itself. Silence returned, the respectful kind. Helena stepped forward when he stepped back. She set both hands on the trestle and let the paper beneath her fingers remind her of all the tables where she had counted in order to survive. You have heard of drains and bridges, she said. Hear now of ink. The physician's eyes flicked to her hands and away again, as if he did not like seeing his favorite subject taken away from him. These are the slips the doctor left the house, she said, lifting the folded papers with their tidy script, the dosage amounts in a hand that hid behind neatness. Observe the dates. Observe the day names written beside them by the butler, who keeps his own habit of order. The magistrate took the top slip and peered. The official on the right leaned in. It reads Sunday, the magistrate said. It does, Helena answered. And here is the apothecary's ledger from the village. Mr. Ellis asked him to bring it. He is too shy to speak, but his book is bolder. You may turn to the page. You will see that on the day in question the shop is marked shut. The vicar will tell you the same. He never sells on the Sabbath. If laudanum was dispensed, it was dispensed in a room where stamps and dates were not seen as law, but as something to be tidied afterward. She did not look at the physician because humiliation is not necessary for truth to do its work. She slid another slip forward. The duty stamp, she said. Tax on paper changed in Lent this year. The sugar cones we receive wear the new seal. So do receipts from the mercer and the smith. This one wears last year's. The doctor's little book numbers its pages. When the slip fell, a maid saw the wrong seal and put it back. If he had torn it out, the numbers would have shouted at us. If he kept it, the seal would whisper. Either way, the truth would speak. The official on the left shrank a degree. The official on the right shifted his elbow away from the physician's hat. The housekeeper came forward at Helena's nod, her keys quiet at her waist. We do not buy on the Sabbath, she said crisply. We do not receive on the Sabbath. We don't open the door except for God or a birth. And God don't send laudanum, a tenant muttered with reverence misdirected, and got an elbow from his wife. The room breathed again. The physician tried to smile. It had no home on his face. Records can be mistaken, he said. The mind is more delicate than drains. It is also stronger, Helena returned. We are speaking of facts. The mind lives beside facts. It does not hide from them when it is clear. Everly appeared in the doorway, late and smooth, having chosen a dramatic entrance over an honest hour. He took in the room with a glance that counted friends as assets and strangers as numbers. He smiled. He opened his mouth. Lord Everly, Gabriel said without turning, you are welcome to sit. You are not welcome to speak for me. Dear cousin, Everly replied, easing fully into the room with his hands spread in a gesture that asked to be forgiven for arriving anywhere. I speak only for the county's peace. The county will find peace, Gabriel said, in the truth. He stepped back and placed his hand on the bench behind him as if to lay claim to wood that had seen weddings and funerals and harvest meetings, and would now see sense if there was any left to see. He looked at Helena. For an instant, the hall vanished, and they were two people in a smaller room where air and light and fear and courage had learned the dance they would need for this. And she felt her chest loosen because he was with her. Not behind. Not in front. With. The magistrate cleared his throat and looked down, then up, then down again. He had the expression of a man who would have liked to avoid attention and had instead stumbled into a moment when someone would remember him for having done the right thing. "Doctor," he said evenly, "your ledger, if you please." The physician produced a little book with numbered pages. He set it on the trestle as if it were an altar. The magistrate lifted it and ran his finger down a page and came to the place where a slip had been returned under the binding haphazardly. The corner of the slip bore a stamp slightly off-center and wrong by a season. He glanced at the apothecary's big book. He nodded once to himself, then again to the room. "Gentlemen," he said to the officials, "we have evidence that certain entries are irregular. We have heard plain testimony regarding estate management. We have observed the subject of this inquiry speak with clarity and answer with control. We have weighed the motives of the petitioner as they show themselves without requiring us to impugn anyone's relations. Is there sufficient ground to proceed with a commission?" The officials conferred in a lean of shoulders and soft paper noises. The left one looked temporarily at the physician as if he had expected more competence for his half-past London fee. The right one shook his head once, just enough to count for decision. "There is not," he said. "There is not," echoed the other, more reluctantly. The magistrate sat back. Relief settled over the room like warmth. It did not explode. It exhaled. Someone clapped by instinct and stopped, embarrassed, and then laughter broke the embarrassment, and clapping followed, and then it transformed into an old parish habit. A boy pulled the hall's bell rope once and then again, and the sound leapt up into the rafters and into the air outside, where it could be what it was, a voice that belongs to everyone. Helena's throat tightened with it. She blinked, and the tear did not fall because she needed both eyes to see the faces in front of her. The tenants looked not just relieved, but larger. The steward's jaw eased. The housekeeper pressed her keys to her dress and stood very straight and very proud. Everleigh's expression altered by degrees. Smile turned down, hands going from open to idle. He did not sulk. He performed graciousness, which is to say, he bowed slightly and turned away before anyone could watch him after that. The physician retrieved his hat with care. He did not meet Helena's eyes. He slipped toward the door, lighter by the weight of arrogance dropped somewhere near the trestle. Gabriel reached her across the small chaos of thanks and murmurs. He did not take her hand at once because the moment required 2 steps of holding themselves upright. Then he did. He lifted her fingers, not to his lips, which would have been theater, but to his chest, a gesture that told her where his gratitude went and where it would stay. "Together," she said, because it was the only word large enough and small enough to be true. "Together," he returned, and the word fitted them like a well-sewn seam. Outside, the bell continued its untidy jubilance. The hall began to empty, with that cheerful disorder English people like to pretend they dislike. Men clapped other men on the shoulder. Women pressed hands. Children who had been shushed were given leave to chatter, then shushed again out of habit. The magistrate shook Gabriel's hand without flourish. Mr. Ellis tucked the ledger under his arm and looked 10 years younger. The butler drew himself up 1 full inch taller and hid a smile by turning aside to conserve his dignity for another day. Gabriel flicked a glance toward the chapel spire just visible over the cottages. Helena nodded. The movement of agreement traveled through him. They walked the lane without a cloak, despite the thin wind that teased at edges. The churchyard gate gave its small, familiar complaint and then allowed them through. The chapel door was, as always, as they had left it. Inside, nothing had changed, and therefore everything had. The rope hung from its beam with a loop of white silk tied low. Helena touched the loop. Her fingers closed around it as if greeting an ally. Gabriel placed his hand over hers. She felt the strength there and the care inside the strength, and it remade something she had thought would always be brittle. "Shall we?" she asked, because asking is its own grace. "We shall," he said. They pulled together. The bell spoke a true hour. The sound filled the small chapel, then expanded, found the air, rolled out across the moor and into the houses and into the field edges and into the barns, into anything that would take it and carry it on. When the rope stilled, they let their hands linger. Silk lay soft under his palm and warm under hers. He looked at her there, in the light that came sideways through the leaded glass, and smiled not like a man practiced in drawbridges and retreat, but like a man whose walls had learned to make rooms rather than prisons. "I could not have done this," he said quietly. "Without you." "You should not have had to," she answered. "But I am glad you did not try." He laughed, a short, warm sound like a match struck and catching. "I am not clever with thanks," he said. "You are better with plans," she returned. "We will make those next." "We will," he promised. They walked back to the hall and were congratulated all over again, which they bore with the patience of people who preferred work to praise. Then they let the hall empty, and the lane, and the court. The house received them with the intimacy that follows strain. It was only afternoon, but the light had that soft quality weather sometimes grants as apology. The library called them without voice. They went there because the books watched without gossip and the chairs did not misunderstand elation for invitation. He closed the door. He did not lock it. He did not need to. Trust, once chosen, makes better bolts than brass. They stood too close to be formal and not close enough to be unkind. In that space, only two people who have saved each other can learn. He lifted his hand to her cheek and stopped a breath away from touching, to give her the option of retreat. She leaned into his palm and made retreat impossible by making it unnecessary. "Gabriel," she said. The name now fitted into her mouth like a word she had always known and simply not used. "Helena," he answered, her name an oath and an apology and a vow in one. He bent his head. He kissed her not as one demands but as one recognizes, and she answered not with hunger at first, but with the relief of a thing allowed, then with hunger, because relief made room for it. The kiss was not hungry for damage, it was hungry for shelter. They allowed themselves that house. When they drew apart, it was not because the moment ended, but because people must sometimes breathe. He rested his forehead against hers, the way he had rested his hand on the pew to survive, and she felt his breath and let hers answer it. "Stay," he said again, though he knew the answer. "I will," she said, and the room believed her because she did. They laughed quietly at nothing, and because laughing at nothing is one of the best proofs of joy. The afternoon moved forward. Tea appeared and was drunk without noticing it had arrived. The housekeeper came to the threshold and looked in once and saw that all was well and withdrew with a look of satisfaction that would have fed any kitchen for a week if kitchens could eat pride. Toward evening, the sky lifted a corner of cloud and let light in over the moor. Lanterns were set in the courtyard, not in celebration, simply because someone remembered they could be beautiful while being useful. Bread came from the ovens with its rough, nutty smell, and even the butler was seen accepting a crust. They walked out under the new light. He offered his arm. She took it, a choice, not a truce. The ribbon lay wrapped in his fingers, and then, with a gesture as casual as breathing and as deliberate as speech, he lifted it and tied it in her hair. Not tight, not to restrain, only to adorn. "May I?" he asked, as if he had not already done it. "You may," she said, amused and softened, because consent can be oval and music, not just a hard yes and no. His fingertips lingered a second at the ribbon's end. He traced the silk with a care that made it a promise again, better for having been used for so many things, and found equal to them. He followed the line of it until it vanished into her hair, and stayed there. The bell gave the hour in the distance, the sound unremarkable and therefore perfect. People moved in the yard like figures in a kindly play. Mr. Ellis passed with his ledger under his arm and pretended he had always held it so lightly. The housekeeper stood in an open door and let the smell of baking go out into the evening, as if it were a rumor she liked to start. The steward's boy ran across the cobbles to chase a dog who would not be caught and laughed aloud in a way that made future days look possible. Helena leaned her head against Gabriel's shoulder for a breath and then lifted it, because leaning is best when shared, not when depended upon. He turned his face toward hers, and in the last of the light his expression was unguarded and whole. "Home?" he asked, and did not mean the building. "Home," she said, and meant him. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.